So I had told you that when we were kind of wrapping up our discussion of emotion last week, one of the things that was worth mentioning was the fact that we largely focused on fear, and then we kind of built that out a little bit into this idea that maybe we can kind of dichotomize emotions as being positive or negative, or another way to think about it is encouraging us to either approach or avoid things that are potentially rewarding or dangerous, harmful to us. And I said that one of the kind of funny things you might be thinking to yourself is, I feel like after going through that discussion of emotions, we didn't talk about the kinds of emotions that maybe come to mind most easily. So when we focus on fear, a lot of that had to do with rapid, um, relatively automatic appraisals. So it didn't have that much to do with the kind of moment to moment conscious awareness of emotions that we often very closely associate with changes in emotional state. And so, one thing that I did mention that I started talking about at the end of Thursday's class was that there is, of course, we use this term affective neuroscience, I think, to introduce this kind of area in the first part of this two-part lecture for emotions last week. And certainly people do study the whole range of emotions that you can think of. One of the challenges is it's very difficult to operationalize and control for the kinds of things that might be relevant when trying to understand individual differences in people's experience of emotion. We talked about how one of the reasons why fear was kind of a good starting point is because it's sort of a universal emotion that we think of as being primal, in the sense that we think that the neurology of a lot of different species that go back a long way in evolutionary history all have common mechanisms for generating a fear-based response. And we talked about how it has great survival advantage. We spent a lot of time talking about that. So even though we can talk about that kind of rapid automatic judgment that might not even reach conscious awareness, like judging trustworthiness, or like changes in your amygdala activation that relate to processing that you're not even consciously aware of. We can also focus on, again, what we might think of as more typical kind of emotions, at least the way we use the term emotion in everyday speech. And one of the things that is really obvious, or I should say, one of the things that you can make a very strong argument for, is the control of emotions is very important for an organism's well-being. And we can think of some more extreme examples, and we can think of various kinds of clinical issues that people face that can be understood, at least in part, as being related to a dysregulation of emotion. So things like anxiety or depression can be in part understood as a dysregulation of emotion. But even in more mundane kind of circumstances, everyday kind of stuff that doesn't necessarily reach the threshold for a clinical diagnosis, even if just someone is feeling, a little bit down, but not clinically depressed. In those kind of everyday, more mild examples, control of emotion can still be very important. Probably, on a long enough run, on a long enough timeline, you would have, serious problems if you had difficulty with controlling emotion, which is evident in these kinds of pathologies we talked about, as being related to emotional dysregulation. But even just to sort of improve your own moment to moment quality of life, to not dwell on a past failure, or to focus on something hopeful or optimistic that you're thinking about, rather than maybe something that went a way that you didn't want it to go. I'm kind of in the back of my mind thinking about the US election today, but I won't get too political. So the sort of the point is, there's good reason to think that our neurological system, our cognitive system, has some potentially pretty sophisticated mechanisms for regulating our emotion. And I don't think we need to spend too long on this model, but it gives you a bit of a sense, not only of some of the kinds of cognitive processes we've talked about in other contexts. And I think this was the example I gave you on Thursday, that you can imagine filtering out things that are bringing you down, that you don't really need to focus on, that aren't constructive, that are just kind of sapping your energy and hurting your mood, raising your stress level. things like worrying about stuff that you can't control, whereas kind of dialing up or increasing the focus of your attentional window on things that make sense for you to control, or rather make sense for you to focus on because you can control them. This is the kind of thing that we're talking about when we make reference to emotional control. And I made the point last time, but it's worth maybe revisiting that this particular model, not that everyone would explain the regulation of emotion in the same way, but this particular model really draws heavily on more general principles of cognitive control. And I think it makes good sense that the same kind of mechanisms that would help you ignore distractors on the screen when you're doing a computer-based experiment and focus on the targets that you're supposed to be attending to. I think it makes good sense that these same kind of mechanisms might be helping us, or potentially hindering us, depending on how much control we have over those mechanisms, in terms of reprioritizing what we're focusing on. And again, if we're focusing and dwelling on negative stuff that we can't control, that's probably going to have a net negative impact on us, whether it's just simple well-being, quality of life, or something more severe down the line. And of course, boosting focus, sort of highlighting the good in your life and being grateful and all of these kinds of things that we often hear people advise us to try to cultivate, these kinds of sort of approaches or perspectives or mental states. Having a bit of control over your emotional system could help with that. So it's also the case, one of the reasons why I wanted to include this diagram is we see a lot of parts of the brain that we have talked about already. And one of the things that hopefully is becoming abundantly clear in this class is it's probably not the case that very many, if any, parts of our brain are actually kind of quote unquote specialized for any one thing. Probably the vast majority of our sort of neurology has evolved to be sort of multi-purpose, generalizable mechanisms that can be sort of deployed or allocated in different ways depending on our needs, whether it's just paying attention to boring targets and ignoring boring distractors on a computer game, or whether it's actually more about how you're engaging with stuff in your kind of everyday world. Part of, I think, what's neat about this is it really shows you how easy it is to fall into the trap of noticing a correlation between activity in one region and one particular kind of task, especially if you do the task over and over again and you keep replicating that effect, right? We don't have to necessarily worry about some of the things like false positives that we've talked about with fMRI. If you're confident you're getting a quote unquote real effect, every time you get someone to do a theory of mind judgment, you see the TPJ become active, for example. It is really tempting to decide or interpret that as being evidence that you've got some kind of sort of uber specialization. But then, of course, when we see some of the things like the dialogues we saw unfold between researchers who argued maybe the TPJ is more about attentional selection, maybe it's more about theory of mind, maybe it's about both, we see that it's very easy to have two researchers sort of independently or even not independently find common ground with a brain region. And so expanding our thinking from just, one size fits all solution, each part does one thing. And especially looking at a model like this that shows you more generalizable mechanisms related to cognitive control that might be relevant for emotional regulation, as well as more mundane stuff, gives you a different kind of appreciation for how versatile the system can be. And of course, this is all just, it's more than conjecture because they have evidence to back it up. But no one's saying that this is actually, quote unquote, how the brain really works. This is just one idea. But again, it I think maps nicely onto some other kind of currents or threads that have run through our discussions this semester so far. Not only seeing some common brain regions identified and associated with different kinds of processes and tasks, but also this idea that we have a versatile system with parts that can interact in different ways depending on the needs that you're confronted with in the moment, the specific needs of the task that you're engaged with. So the last part of this study, or rather the last part of this lecture, this presentation file, was this one study that looked at the effect of meditation on the attentional blink. So one thing that I'd like to highlight is these guys, these researchers had a group of people engaging in one particular type of meditation for 10 to 12 hours a day for 3 months. So that is a huge amount of training. And I don't remember offhand when we talked about the cognitive neuroscience of video games, how long they trained for. They had quite extensive training too. And you do often see really extensive periods of training associated with experiments. And there's a trade-off, like in a different sense than we usually talk about, but it's very expensive to do that. Now, these people would have been most likely, when these kinds of studies take place, it's usually the case that people decide to go to something like a meditation retreat anyway. And then you find people who are already doing this and you kind of piggyback on what they're already doing and say, can we run a couple experiments and record some data at your retreat? It's not the case that these people are doing this 3 months of training for the exclusive purpose of participating in this experiment. And just thinking methodologically a little bit, you probably have a greater chance of observing a statistically significant difference if you're looking at effects of training, like pre-training, post-training kind of differences. And we'll talk about brain training after the break, and we'll get into that a little bit. But what I'm getting at is you could just do an hour of meditation training and you probably wouldn't expect that would significantly change the brain. You could probably get someone to do a decade of meditation training and you would expect that probably would change the brain. But as an experimental researcher, you often have to find a balance point where you say, this is enough time that I think there's a reasonable chance I'll see an effect that I'm hypothesizing about, but it's not excessive in the sense that it's not going to bankrupt me. If you're paying participants, for example, if you want to run 1,000 participants, that gets really expensive. And just, of course, time is a resource. So that's another factor to keep in mind. So I talked about the attentional blink during the video game lecture. So you guys probably remember that. It involves this sort of figurative attentional blink, where if you're looking for two targets in a stream of rapidly presented letters and numbers, you typically find the first target, no problem. That's usually abbreviated as T1. But then T2, this is where the blink kind of analogy comes into play. When you see, and as I say here, go back to our video game lecture if you want a diagram, a schematic of how this works, if this is sounding a bit fuzzy to you. But you basically, your attention kind of gets used up, so to speak, by the first target. And if the second target appears almost immediately after, so these letters and numbers are being presented very quickly, and there might be just a few milliseconds between the first and the second target. And the idea is most people miss the second target. And it's just by virtue of, it seems to be the case that when you deploy focus attention and select for a target or something that you're trying to process more deeply or recognize, there seems to be this lag where you have this figurative attentional blink where you can't take in new information. So people usually miss the second target. And of course, if the first target wasn't there, they would see whatever was labeled as the second target in my first example. It has nothing to do with the stimuli itself. It's just the fact that the second target comes so soon after the first target, you have this attentional blink and you miss it. So what we see is people who go through this training, and when you compare their pre-training to post-training ERPs, behaviorally, you see they perform better. They're more likely to detect both the first and second target. And again, everyone gets the first target. The interesting thing is, are you able to also kind of catch the second target in this situation? And we saw action video game players showed, after a manipulation, an improvement in their ability to perceive the second target. So we see something very similar with the meditators. Interestingly, you might expect sort of just intuitively that they might show a larger response to the first or the second target if they're attending to something and catching something, noticing, perceiving something that the other participants, the control group, doesn't. And in fact, they're actually separating these on the basis of not only whether you were trained or not, but and pre-post or pre-training and post-training, that's time 1 and time 2. They're also separating this as a function of whether you experience the attentional blink, that's the dark line. So that would be people who caught the first target, but not the second, as well as the green line is plotting people who didn't show an attentional blink, who successfully identified both the first and second target. So there's actually a lot going on here. But I can kind of just quickly direct your attention to the fact that the P3 for the first target changes for people who don't show an attentional blink after training. And the way it changes is maybe not how you would expect. What you see is you actually have less of a neural response. There's a smaller amplitude to that P300 for people after training who don't show an attentional blink. And so you might kind of think, well, I'd almost expect it would be the opposite when they show a larger neural response if they caught something the other people didn't. But what we think is happening here is they are more efficiently deploying their attention. So they don't have to try as hard to attend to the first target. And so the explanation here, the interpretation at least, which is not definitive, we could argue with it, but the interpretation the authors provided was that essentially they sort of have more residual attentional resources because they don't use them all up detecting the first target, and maybe most people do, and that's part of why the attentional blink happens, perhaps, because for those few milliseconds after you've deployed attention to the first target, you don't have any residual attentional resources to deploy to another target that appears in close temporal proximity. So this is suggesting that after meditation, these people are actually, in a sense, trying less hard, which might have to do with their more relaxed mental state, which might be kind of the proximal cause or one of them, which translates to better performance in the attentional blink, and sort of, to put it in more everyday terms, better attentional functioning. So what does this have to do with emotions? The idea here is that if you're able to modulate what you're paying attention to and what you're kind of shutting out, what you're processing deeply and what you're not, if you have more control over that based on what you want to focus on and what you want to not focus on, the idea is that could extend to, not dwelling on things that make you upset and focusing on things that maybe make you happy. The final point about this that's kind of interesting is the meditation doesn't involve training with, it doesn't involve training a specific sequence of actions necessarily. You could kind of conceive of, I suppose, meditating as learning to engage a series of mental processes. But often when we see training effects, it's when people actually have to make overt, explicit responses. So for example, we see training effects on the attentional blink. If you just practice the attentional blink over and over again, you can get a little bit better. So the fact that these meditators aren't making overt, explicit responses, they're just sort of, as this is the way the textbook author puts it, but I think it's a good point. They're sort of just engaging in pure thought. They're not actually, there's no motor action that's being reinforced. They're just changing the way they're thinking. And we're still seeing pretty profound changes in attentional functioning just by thinking differently, which is, not a surprise to people who understand the power of thought, but to people who laugh at comments like the power of positive thinking, and not that I'm making fun of those people, but I think people don't appreciate sometimes how much thinking in different ways can change, down the line, how you interpret and perceive things. So that's emotion. So let's start language. Now, I feel like sometimes I need to really give you guys a lot of context for some of these concepts when they're things we're not as familiar with in everyday sort of use. Cognitive control, I think at this point, a third-year course, you guys all have some idea what that means. But if you ask a random person on the street who's never taken a psych course what cognitive control means, they could probably kind of guess, but it's not kind of immediately obvious what that's all about or why it's important, or what kinds of tasks would even be relevant for studying cognitive control. Control is a pretty broad term, so is cognitive. Of course, as we saw, cognitive control is a broad concept, and that's part of why those researchers felt that a model built on kind of principles of cognitive control could pretty adequately capture how we regulate our emotions. And this is, very much in step with one of the other things I said at the tail end of that last lecture just this morning, that we have a lot of sort of domain general mechanisms in our brain, in our cognitive system, in our neurology, that rarely, if ever, are geared towards one specific thing, even if that's kind of the context experimentally that we understand the neurological mechanism to function in. So language, on the other hand, I don't have to worry about giving you guys a long preamble and setting it up with a lot of context, because I think we all understand the importance of language. Something as simple as me through my computer in this, pandemic era, talking to you and explaining concepts, and you seeing words that also represent concepts. Reading the textbook if you're following along with the strongly recommended readings, watching YouTube videos that give you, slightly different angles on some of these concepts that we talk about in our class. Language and communication in general, representing information in a way that you can convey thoughts and ideas and beliefs and feelings and whatever you want to other people, is hugely important. It's hugely adaptive. The ability to learn about how our brains work just by listening to someone else talk about it. And I learned how the brain works. I mean, I don't understand it fully, of course, none of us do, but I mean, I learned that stuff by listening to other people talk and reading other books and reading papers and thinking about these things and explaining them to students and having students ask me questions that directed my attention to things that I should focus on, more clearly explaining, or things that I don't need to spend as much time explaining. Language is really, really important. If we wanted to sort of look at it in a hedonistic way, if we look at art, if we look at, music, which we could consider to be a form of language, if we look at poetry or, a screenplay, novels, there's so much to talk about related to language that is important to people's day-to-day lives, both from a survival standpoint, right? If you got lost in the back country, but you have a cell phone and you're able to call for help, without speech, you couldn't do that. That might save your life. But also in the context of just enjoying life and doing things that bring us pleasure, language is incredibly important. It tends to be, depending on how you kind of measure this or operationalize it, it's arguably one of the most highly studied topics in psychology. It has a long history of being kind of a point of comparison to discuss lots of larger issues. Throughout the 20th century, the nature versus nurture debate was something that language factored prominently in. It's often an example people reach for when they try to think about more general concepts like evolution and shaping our brain to behave in certain ways. One of the things that makes language so powerful, I mean, there are lots of properties, but the fact that it generates this generativity, that it is associated with this generativity. You have a handful of elements. We have 26 letters in the English language, and they can be combined and recombined in an unlimited number of ways to generate an unlimited number of messages, to convey an unlimited number of thoughts. This simple, basic kind of set of tools is capable of really capturing virtually any kind of, with some limitations, of course, it's capable of at least roughly approximately capturing all kinds of ideas. developmental stuff has factored in prominently in the study of language. How do people acquire language? You know, one of the sort of things that almost just seems unbelievable is the fact that an infant growing up in any society with any number of languages seems to pick up that language with almost no effort. It's almost as if they just kind of absorb it through osmosis. Um, so the question of how our brain is able to do that, again, so easily and with so much variability across, you know, the hundreds of different languages that we know about or more in our world. One kind of sort of basic set of DNA seems able to build out and sort of uh, internalize any kind of language that they're exposed to at the right sort of developmental window. We think that's quite extraordinary, and that has in part factored into these discussions I was alluding to about sort of nature versus nurture. Does our brain set us up to just soak in language, or is it something a bit different? The question of how differences in languages, but at the same time, how similarities and commonalities across language might help us understand what the kind of quote unquote universal rules of grammar are, if they even exist. People debate whether there are actually kind of universal rules that apply to all languages or not. One of the frequent topics is also this debate about whether language is uniquely human. Non-human animals communicate in lots of ways, but some people have argued that language as we know it, in part things like this property of generativity, may be uniquely human. Not everyone agrees with that. One of the huge hurdles in trying to compare non-human cognition to human cognition is, ironically, without language, it makes it really tough to do things like ask dogs what they're thinking or how they're responding to things. Nevertheless, we find lots of clever ways to make inferences about what cognitive stuff is happening in the brains of other non-human animals. Now, we're going to come back to Broca's area and Wernicke's area. And I know you guys have been hearing about these areas since your first year. We don't need to talk too much about them now, other than to remind you that the discovery that damage to Broca's area or damage to Wernicke's area, these two regions in the brain, seem to very reliably lead to particular kinds of behavioral deficits. This was one of the early indications that localization of function might be, in some contexts, an appropriate way to understand brain structure and function and how the two work together, how the two are related. It's also argued to be really important from a cognitive perspective, because even though localization of function was starting to be understood through other examples, like what happens to your motor control when your motor cortex is damaged, or what happens, for example, to your vision when your occipital lobe is damaged, those things arguably overlapped with both what we would consider today cognitive constructs, but also somewhat non-cognitive constructs. Vision is arguably not just about cognition. Motor control is arguably not just about cognition. However, understanding language or producing language, some people have argued, represents more of a kind of purely cognitive phenomenon. So the fact that we saw these systematic relationships between parts of the brain and very specific cognitive constructs that couldn't really be understood in a non-cognitive way, historically was quite important. And you'll know that the typical story is Broca's area is important for producing language, in particular producing spoken language, and that can in part be understood by its proximity to premotor regions that control parts of your body, your mouth in particular, that you need to manipulate in a certain way to produce certain sounds of speech. So, you know, as I say, I'm sure you remember Broca's area usually associated with language production, Wernicke's area usually associated with language comprehension. That and so, you know, just like Broca's area is close to regions involved with motor control that sort of provide a sensible explanation, perhaps, if you want to put it that way, or provide one reason why the system works well, because parts related to motor control, which are necessary for producing speech, are close, and therefore communication should be easier and more efficient between those two regions. Similarly, we see Wernicke's area is very close to our primary auditory cortex. If you know a bit about those parts, you know that A1 and the belt cortex are kind of subdivisions of your primary auditory cortex. And just like we talk about the lateral geniculate nucleus, the LGN in the thalamus routing visual signals from the eye to your visual cortex, the MGN in the thalamus, the medial geniculate nucleus, serves a similar role related to the signals coming from your ears, the hair cells bending and transducing acoustic information in the environment that gets rerouted through your thalamus through the MGN. So we have kind of what we would consider complementary parts of the brain in adjacent regions that seem to help accomplish the respective goals of producing and comprehending language. So my warning is, and you may have heard this kind of discussion depending on what level of depth you've talked about these two areas at, the kind of standard oversimplified version is, Broca's area, Wernicke's area associated with production and comprehension. We'll return to these on Thursday when we do the second part of this lecture, but this is a bit of an oversimplification, as is often the case. There's nothing unusual about that. We sort of have a history of attributing larger, coarser scale regions to things that are a little bit more oversimplified than future research suggests. Of course, at the time, this was some pretty remarkable precision in the 19th century to be identifying a brain region as small as Wernicke's area or Broca's area. They're not tiny, but they're much smaller than lobes, for example, to be identifying these as being reliably associated with that kind of pattern of behavioral deficits. Even though by today's standards, we sort of scoff at it a little bit and say, well, that's not quite right. With the tools they had available, a pretty amazing series of advancements. Now, we're not really going to talk about this fellow and his house model, other than to say that this individual, even though you don't hear about this name as commonly as being associated with Broca's and Wernicke's area, he was in many ways very important and very influential in understanding how these different variants of aphasia relate to slight differences in where the brain damage or what parts of the brain are involved or what parts of the brain are compromised. So I would never ask you to memorize this and sort of fully dive into what all of these subtypes are. This is just out of interest, but kind of the point is this guy with the basic starting point of, okay, there are inputs in the brain, there are outputs, there are processes that are involved with semantic processing, right? So if you ask me, to name a breed of dog, I have to do something with the auditory signal that's coming through my ears, right? That involves input. I have to understand what you're saying. I have to sort of activate my concept of dog, maybe retrieve some examples, some exemplars of different breeds. That involves knowledge. Think back to our memory chapters and the parts of the brain involved with that kind of stuff, which are, of course, quite widely distributed. And then, of course, depending on how you're responding, if you're verbalizing response, you're going to need to use some of the parts of the brain that are near Broca's area, including Broca's area, to move your lips and your tongue and your, everything about your speaking apparatus in the right way. So this guy, the clever thing that he did was knowing that we have these kinds of inputs and knowing a bit about some of the locations of major inputs, outputs, and connections with semantically relevant parts of the brain. He predicted a bunch of different subtypes of aphasia, and that's what's listed here with the numbers. And we don't use, so you'll recognize 1 is Broca's, 2 is Wernicke's. So this is saying if this part gets damaged, we would expect Broca's aphasia, which of course affects production of language. If 2 gets damaged, we would expect Wernicke's aphasia, which is more, albeit as an oversimplification, associated with impairments in comprehension, and so on and so on. So at the time when he did this, we only knew about Broca's and Wernicke's aphasia. And so he sort of hypothesized about these 6 other subtypes that no one had ever heard of, and said, based on our limited understanding of how the brain is wired up and the kinds of connections that we're dealing with, I would predict that if this major junction gets damaged, it would have the following behavioral deficits, or be associated with the following pattern of behavioral deficits. If this junction gets damaged, it would be associated with a slightly different pattern of behavioral deficits, and so on and so on. Now, you heard me talk about this idea of post hoc explanations. This is kind of like the exact opposite of a post hoc explanation. Rather than seeing a pattern of data and trying to explain it after the fact, well, there were 2 major deficits and people had brain damage in 2 major regions, so I guess maybe one region is associated with one deficit, one's associated with another. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's post hoc. And we talked about how sometimes you risk, for example, reading too much into what might be a false positive when you get too excited about post hoc explanations. This was really clever, not only to have the foresight to anticipate or hypothesize about specific kinds of patterns of behavioral deficits that we may associate with what we could consider subtypes of aphasia. But we, slowly over time, case studies have been reported and published that more or less correspond to each of these subtypes with brain damage at the junctions that were hypothesized to be the relevant parts of the brain that, if damaged, would lead to these particular patterns of deficits. So, this is taking the kind of typical experimental approach where you come up with a hypothesis before you know what happens, and then you collect data and you compare the data and analyze it. You compare it, in whatever way makes sense. You make a critical comparison and you test your hypothesis. This is kind of like doing that over a really long timeline. So it was very, very sort of a visionary-like thing to do. Now, I don't want to spend hardly any time on this. I think you guys are aware that language is organized hierarchically. I did not pronounce hierarchically very well, but I, am pronouncing a bunch of words. I'm stringing them together in a sentence. My sentences consist of a bunch of words. Oftentimes, in sort of informal terms, we talk about words being made up of letters, which is true. But of course, linguistics dictates a certain kind of breakdown of the elements of language. And really all I want to do here is remind you that if you say to me, I want to study language, that's kind of like saying I want to study emotion, but not telling me which emotion. If you say I want to study language, you really need to specify what sort of unit of language, at what level are you studying it? It's a bit like levels of analysis. To go back to an old concept you probably learned about in intro psych, we can learn about depression by understanding how neurotransmitters might be involved, but we can also understand depression by studying how changes in one's environment might be relevant, right? Maybe losing a job can make you more likely to become depressed. Maybe that makes you less likely to hang out with your friends because you don't feel motivated to. Maybe that makes you even more depressed, and there's a feedback loop, right? That's a totally different kind of level of analysis than looking at how serotonin or glutamate or dopamine function might change when you're depressed. So, looking at these topics from all these different angles, it's all very productive, but you need to be clear about kind of what element you're looking at. And so for the experiment that we'll kind of spend a decent chunk of the rest of the lecture on, you want to be aware that a phoneme is the smallest unit, essentially, in language, that if you change it, changes the meaning. Morphemes are almost, they're kind of a close second, perhaps, because prefixes and suffixes, like when you add an S, right? If I took off the S, if it was just morpheme, that would be singular. Adding an S makes it plural. The S by itself doesn't have inherent meaning. But it's something that you can add to change the meaning of other representations that are there. But the phoneme is considered the smallest. It's like a speech of sound. So it's a little bit like a syllable. It's not quite, but if you know what a syllable is, that might help you. And so for this ERP study we're going to talk about shortly, they focus on the recognition of phonemes. They're not dealing with anything sort of higher level. They're not looking at